Could more stress actually lead to better health? It sounds a little counterintuitive, but according to Dr. Sharon Bergquist, certain forms of stress, what she describes as good stress like fasting, high-intensity exercise, phytochemical consumption, thermotherapy, and even specific types of psychological stress, can activate powerful survival pathways in the body. In this episode, we break down her book, The Stress Paradox, and explore how to reframe stress from something to fear into something we can strategically use to live longer, think clearer, and feel better. On the topic of stress, I have written and published a book of my own, and we were just talking offline. We worked with some of the same people who helped us get our book out there. I remember the book writing process. I have mixed feelings about it. There are a lot of very fond memories, and there are some stressful moments as well, of course. What was that writing process like for you?
I would say the hardest thing I've ever done in my 30 plus years in medicine and research. So I thoroughly can relate to the challenges of writing. But I would also say it's the most rewarding thing I've done throughout that time. And for me, I focused on how it was good stress and the rewards from it, how fulfilling it was to share what I had known and built upon throughout so much of my career. So I focused on the good stress aspect of it. We became Team Good Stress, and I think that helped us through the rockier parts when you're under deadlines and there's just a lot to do.
You said good stress there a few times, and I'm sure we're going to clarify the difference between good stress and bad stress and help people understand that not all stress is created equal in terms of how it affects us. But starting with the title of your book here, what is the stress paradox that all of us are faced with?
The paradox is that we have long known that stress can be harmful. We have about 90 years of research showing that the pathology that results from stress. Essentially, it can damage and hurt every part of our body. And that's how we associate stress as something that harms us. But we also have, really in the last 2 decades, a lot of molecular and cell biology explaining how stress can enrich us, how we can grow from stress. And we're learning that the good stress is helping us build resilience to deal with the more harmful types of stressors, which are the more chronic stressors. And the paradox is that we need stress to build stress resilience, right? So our goal really changes. It's not to get rid of stress in our lives. It's not to cure stress, but it's to optimize the stress in our lives.
And how would you say the average person is going, today when it comes to balancing out or getting the right ratio of these different types of stress that we might define as good and favorable for our health versus that is not?
Currently, I think we predominantly have the harmful bad stress in our life, largely because some of it is inevitable and it finds us, but also because I don't believe people are aware that there is such a thing as good stress. And I believe that good stress has actually been worked out of the fabric of our lives and is becoming a risk factor for so much of the chronic mental and physical illnesses that we're seeing today.
Is that what Sustress is? I think I read that word in your book, and that was the first time that I'd come across that. Can you explain to us what Sustress means?
Yes. So the framework of stress has actually evolved, even though it hasn't really made its way to a lot of people, even within medicine, appreciating that change. So we know that there's distress, which is harmful stress, and eustress, the good stress that we're talking about, but this Sustress is inadequate stress. And we're learning that it's just as harmful as too much stress. So the relationship between the stress and the effect it has on our body and our resilience is not linear. So with the linear model, you think that, okay, if too much stress is harmful, if you can just bring stress down to a mild to moderate amount, you would just avoid the harm of stress. But what we're realizing is that when you are in this range where stress is mild to moderate, it benefits us. It makes us stronger. And the relationship is more parabolic, kind of like an upside down U, like the St. Louis Arch. So with that understanding, we're realizing that not enough is one bottom part of that curve, just like too much brings us down at the bottom of the curve.
And are we talking about different kind of stimuli, different inputs, different types of stress here? So when you're saying not enough of certain, quote unquote, I guess, good stress can be just as problematic as too much, quote unquote, bad stress, are we talking about different exposures? Are we talking about different stimuli having a different effect on our physiology?
Yeah. So that's such a key point. So the nature of the stressors are different, but the dose and duration are also different. So you can differentiate good from bad stress by what I would call the 3Ds. Essentially, their design, what they're made of, the type of stress, the dose, which is the intensity, and the duration. So the harmful stressors by their nature are ones that we can't control. We have no sense of mastery over. Their intensity is generally overwhelming. The duration is more chronic. The beneficial stressors, their nature is such that the underlying theme, the unifying theme is that they activate a certain part of our genome that really activates our regenerative repair processes. And they're brief in duration and they're mild to moderate in intensity. So you can have a good stress that can become harmful if it is high in intensity, or essentially too much of a good thing can be bad.
Right. And would you say we've done a pretty good job as a science community in being able to identify not only what those good stresses are, but what the appropriate dose would be that is safe and beneficial?
I think one of the biggest challenges is finding the right dose, because there's such an individual component, right? Finding the optimal amount, which is really this Goldilocks amount, where it's just past your comfort zone, but not to the point where it's harmful, is not only different person to person, but it can be different for the same person on a different day, depending on your recovery. So I think this is where the science really intersects with personalizing the recommendations. And I think that this is an area where we're going to get far more diagnostics in science and in medicine to find that optimal zone. But the beauty of this is that we are learning that we have the ability to regenerate our body, that we have this incredible capacity to repair and heal. And it brings this whole futuristic notion of regenerative medicine to the everyday, where these are daily practices that we can do that can repair damage and regenerate our body. So I don't think we even communicate that part very well.
Right. I want to put a pin in dose, and let's make sure we come back to at least if we can't be super specific on some of these things, we can give people some guardrails. Like, what are some things that they could think about that may be an indication that they're not doing enough, or they're doing too much and they're not recovering and they're overdoing it. And just because we haven't kind of made it super clear, we're going to get to what these good stresses are in a moment. But high level, we're talking about things like hot therapy, cold therapy, and exercise, and certain dietary exposures. So things that people will have heard of, but perhaps not in this context, understanding the biology and the physiology, which I think is super interesting. And if we come back, just take a step back to the biology here. In your book, you say we don't ever truly go back to normal after encountering stress. We emerge with a new baseline. That sounds very exciting. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, when our bodies encounter a stress at the level of our cells, stress is anything that challenges our body. It could be physical, it could be mental. So we're really, first of all, expanding the scope of how we're viewing stress. And that disrupts a natural balance in our body that we call homeostasis. And our bodies have feedback mechanisms that try and reestablish that balance. But we don't ever truly, quote, go back to normal after we have dealt with a stressor. Some stressors deplete us, and we really find that we return and emerge at a lower set point where we have lower resilience. And some stressors help us build a higher set point. So we overcompensate and we net resilience. And so the good stressors are ones where we net resilience. The harmful everyday stressors, to put some examples around this, would be things like the processed foods, being sedentary, financial hardship. Those are ones that we net lower resilience. And part of the way you can differentiate between the two is essentially how they make you feel. Right? With these harmful stressors, when you encounter them and you recover, you feel fatigued, depleted, burnt out. With the good stressors, you feel just as it's regenerating your body, there's this regenerative energy. So you feel excitement and energy and creativity. So those are kind of some proxies for trying to figure out what's happening at a cellular level based on how you encounter and deal with any stressor.
Right. And that kind of after feeling, I guess, is not to be confused with, at least in my experience, during an acute bout of kind of good stress. I guess to set the expectations, it can be challenging and difficult and feel hard, and you can feel like you want to avoid it or stop.
Right. Absolutely. When you're dealing with a stress, I mean, you are getting pushed out of your natural balance, right? Your body wants so hard to reestablish that balance. And by definition, you're essentially pushing yourself past a certain comfort zone. You're doing something hard. That is going to be uncomfortable. But the key here is that you're doing it in the service of reaching a higher level of capability, a higher level of human possibility, and a higher level of human performance. And as I'm sure we'll get to, at a higher level of disease resilience and a slowing of our biological age. So it's enduring the hardship in the service of reaching this higher level of health and human potential.
Yeah, that I guess is my next question is, how impactful is this when it comes to our health span and avoiding chronic disease risk? And if we were to, I guess, frame this as, problem being that we're not exposing ourselves to enough good stress. So there's a lack of that kind of across society, that Sustress, as you described it. How much is that impacting the chronic disease burden, do you think, that we're seeing today?
I think it's hugely impactful. I think this is such a key as a missing factor in what we are taking out of the fabric of our lives. So much of the focus on living healthier lives and working towards living longer has been on removing the factors that we know are harmful to our health. Again, things like the processed food, sedentarism. But we aren't focusing enough on what we could be adding. And the reason these are just so critical is that these are the most powerful levers we have in our lifestyle. The fact that we have this innate basal level of regenerative capacity to heal, to repair our body, and that our lifestyle has the ability to activate that, help us reach a higher basal level of these repair processes, makes it such a critical part of how we approach health and well-being, right? It really changes everything. It's truly transformative. And I think when the idea of incorporating these good stressors and activating our body's ability to heal becomes mainstream, it will fundamentally create this course correction that we so need in our lives today to live longer lives.
It's almost as if we've gone from one extreme to the other in terms of our ancestors lived a very uncomfortable life. And so it makes a lot of sense that we optimized for comfort. But we've optimized for comfort to the extent that we've become so comfortable that we've lost this really important input that activates these regenerative systems in our body. So there's a psychological mindset kind of shift that would be required here across society to say, if we want to live long, healthy lives, it can't always be about comfort. We have to accept that being uncomfortable, at least in acute periods, is actually beneficial for us.
Yeah. I mean, and that's such a key message because our genome has adapted to living through some harsh periods. So our genome is really optimized for doing hard things. Our genome was not made for abundance. It wasn't made for comfort. And our bodies work through bioplasticity, essentially use it or lose it. So when we endure these episodes of hardship, we're training our bodies. We are building resilience like we build any muscle. And when we're not, we are lowering our resilience. So I think our genome has really selected for us needing to do hard things. And what we're learning now by looking at the molecular fingerprint of every choice, every action, every behavior on our genome, we're essentially reverse engineering the lifestyle we were meant to live. And that lifestyle requires us to have these moments, these brief bursts of some hardship, some adversity genes, because these adversity genes are the ones that not only helped us as a species just thrive, but it's helped us become one of the most successful species on the planet.
The word hormesis comes up quite a bit in
Yes.
this conversation. What does hormesis mean?
Yeah, hormesis, I will call the science of good stress. And the word derives from the Greek to excite. And it's how mild to moderate stressors activate or excite the parts of our genome that contain these adversity genes that encode for our body's ability to repair, heal, and regenerate. So essentially, hormesis is the science of mild to moderate stress followed by recovery to help us reach this higher level of resilience and human capability.
And in the book, I think you described, was it 7 kind of key cellular response systems? So these are, I guess, the biological pathways that are activated, or certain genes are activated, and then subsequently these biological pathways are activated in response to certain stimuli like cold water immersion or high intensity interval training. Is that the right way to think about this?
Exactly. So we have pieces of the puzzle of the lifestyle components that help with longevity. They also help with disease prevention. A lot of the things that you just mentioned, whether it's cold water immersion, high intensity interval training, hormesis is the unifying principle that brings together the how and the why these lifestyle components are so critical for us. And the point of convergence is really at the level of our cells. And when we endure these stressors, these beneficial types of stressors, they activate 7 key cellular response mechanisms in our cells. Essentially, these mechanisms control what I'll call the 4 R's. They help us resist damage so that we resist oxidative damage and inflammatory damage. They help us repair our proteins in our DNA through our DNA damage response. We have 2 cellular mechanisms for protein quality control. We have the unfolded protein response and our heat shock proteins. They activate the sirtuin response, so they help us regenerate our energy systems through their really downstream effect on our mitochondria and building our mitochondria. And they help us recycle our cells through the autophagy response. So those are really the key repair and defense mechanisms. and they're encoded in these 7 cellular responses. So we think of the stress response as being this fight or flight response, right? Driven by our autonomic nervous system, where we encounter a stressful event and it sets down this cascade of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, where we release cortisol. And that is a split second kind of life or death response that we have when we undergo this fight or flight. What happens at a much slower time scale are these cellular stress responses. So the stress gets transmitted to the level of our cells. And for hours, days, and really even a lifetime after our stress exposure, we are activating these responses that help us adapt so that we can become stronger and more resilient, so that when we encounter these stressors in the future, we are better adapted.
Which speaks to, I guess, the intensity and duration, or both, being really important, because if you are doing one of these activities, be it ice or exercise, but you're doing it in a comfortable sense, you're not really giving your cells a reason to adapt and become more resilient.
Yes, exactly. And this is where you kind of want to find this Goldilocks just right amount of the stress exposure. So if you gently stress yourself, for example, let's take exercise as the sample stressor. If you leisurely maybe just walk in a room, being back in the day when we had fax machines, let's say walk over to the fax machine, at a really leisurely pace, that is a low intensity activity, not enough to disrupt homeostasis. So you're not activating these stress responses. And then when you have kind of pushed beyond that, the reason that loses its benefit is that every time you disrupt your homeostatic balance, there's a certain amount of energy your body has to expend to reestablish that balance. So the improvement in our ability to become more resilient based on relative to a control level is limited. There's a ceiling effect. So from any exposure, you can gain about 20 to 25% improvement compared to control. But with this pattern of stress and then recovery, and the repetition of stress recovery over time, you can improve 60 to 90%. So you can almost double the human potential, but it's not by pushing yourself to an extreme with any of these stressors. It's by maintaining this mild to moderate range followed by recovery.
Mm-hmm. So you're consistently just kind of nudging, forcing these cells to activate these genes and become more resilient, making sure you're not providing too high of a dose that has some type of deleterious effect.
That's exactly right. And the key here is also the recovery, right? Because when you expose your cells to stress, your cells enter a stress-resistant mode where they operate more efficiently. They turn on these housekeeping functions of repair. It's in recovery that you grow preferentially healthier cells, you grow new connections, your body remodels. So structurally and functionally, you're building resilience in the recovery phase. So the recovery is just as important as the stress.
What does recovery, I guess, mean to you? I think it might mean something different to everyone, but in this context, if we're saying that recovery is really important because you're going to expose your body and cells to a particular stress, but in order to reap the benefits of that, you need to get recovery right. What does that look like?
The recovery looks different depending on the stressor. And I do detail how to get to this optimal zone for each of the stressors in the book through a protocol, and what is the optimal way to recover from each of these stressors. For example, if the stressor is intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, the recovery would be a nutrient-dense meal plan during the eating window that has adequate protein, fiber, and minerals and vitamins. If the stressor is exercise, the appropriate recovery would be some form of active recovery or passive recovery, and that also included adequate sleep or rest. If the stressor is psychological stress, some type of, let's say, deadline that you had to meet where this was something rewarding, it was something that was stressful, but in a way that challenged you, that you want to be stretched and bent, the appropriate recovery for you to get better at handling future psychological stress would be something that is different than just relaxation. I think people often think if I've gone through a lot of emotional or psychological stress, just reading a good book, making a nice meal, these are all nice ways to relax and find joy, but you get a deeper level of bioplasticity in your neuroplasticity when that recovery incorporates a level of like non-sleep deep rest. So my favorite ways of doing that, for example, are by being fully immersed in nature. For example, doing a nature prescription, which is essentially letting all of your senses take in nature, finding 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can feel, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. But this full immersion would be an optimal recovery where you gain the most neuroplasticity from the exposure to that stressor. So it's different for each stressor, and it also depends on where you are in terms of your resilience at a starting point, where some people need more of the recovery, less of the stress to be optimized.
I just found the quote in your book that I liked, and you might have mentioned it before: stress activates recovery remodels, which speaks to exactly what you're talking about here. Are there any objective biomarkers? Everyone's wearing wearables these days, and you can see your sleep score, you can see your resting heart rate or HRV. Are these helpful at all for considering whether you have the right dose of the stress in place and or the right recovery in place?
Yeah, I find that heart rate variability is one of the more helpful of the measurements. If you have created a stress that's too intense, let's say overtrained, too hard a workout, heart rate recovery would be a way to know that you've probably pushed yourself too much with a stressor and you need more time for recovery. I find that to be one of the more helpful measures. And then there are a lot of biomarkers to help you know if your intervention over time is helping you get healthier. So what are relevant metrics, for example? Presumably the goal of doing this, again, is not stress for the sake of stressing yourself out. It's stress for the sake of becoming more disease resilient, for slowing your biological age. So there are certainly lab biomarkers, and we can go through ones that I think are very relevant. There are also some aging biomarkers, that we've used in our clinical studies, and certainly they are also in evolution, but I think some can be very useful and practical. And that is one way to know if what you are doing over some course of time, which I'll term an intervention using these good stressors, but I almost hesitate to use that term because I think of good stressors as a way we're meant to live, as opposed to thinking about them as the intervention. I actually think our Western lifestyle is the intervention, and this is a big human experiment that isn't going well, and that these stressors are more the normative lifestyle that we were meant to live. But nonetheless, we can measure the pre and post and see if we're achieving our goals.
I am absolutely excited to share an exclusive offer with the Proof community. This is a limited time offer just for my audience, and no doctor referral is needed. Function Health is a comprehensive at-home blood testing service that gives you access to over 100 biomarkers, covering everything from heart, liver, kidney, and metabolic health to hormone levels, inflammation, and nutrient status. That, my friends, is 5 times more testing than the average physical. I chose Function for my own blood work and to be a sponsor of this show because they are the best in the world when it comes to helping you understand and own your health. It's true, the depth and quality of their testing is unrivaled. And as regular listeners of this show will know, you cannot optimize what you don't measure. Don't guess, test. Use Function to know exactly where your health is today, and then intervene with evidence-based medicine and lifestyle changes to feel your best and reduce your risk of chronic disease. With Function, you get access to very important markers like Lp(a), a genetically driven cardiovascular risk factor, ApoB, the most predictive marker of atherosclerosis, and LH and FSH, reproductive hormones typically missing from standard lab panels. It's not uncommon for these biomarkers and others to be elevated. For example, over 50% of Function members have an ApoB level, and over 20% have an Lp(a) level that is above the optimal range. You can even add on harder to access tests like cystatin C, a very sensitive marker of kidney function, as well as selenium and iodine, nutrients that are essential for thyroid and overall health, yet rarely tested. So what are you waiting for? Run over to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill today and be one of 1,000 listeners to score a $100 credit. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. Yeah, let's step through some of those so people have an idea of a few things they can keep an eye on as they're integrating some of these good stressors in their life. So if we start with lab biomarkers, what are some of the results on their regular blood panel that they might keep an eye on and use as an indicator that these good stressors that they're adding to their life are effective and are beneficial for them?
I'll start with some very basic labs that are so accessible and simple that you can get through a regular doctor's visit, and they're so informative. I think hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month average of blood sugar, is very important, critically important. And I would put fasting blood sugar in that bucket. And one that is inexpensive but not always tested is an insulin level. And I would utilize those 3 to get a sense of not only your blood sugar, but also a sense of your insulin resistance level. And to me, the reason I think they're all important is, first of all, metabolic health plays such a critical role in our overall health. It is really the pathway and the process that increases our risk of cardiometabolic disease, cancer risk, neurodegenerative disease. So I think getting our metabolic health in order is such a critical piece. And the reason I like to incorporate a fasting insulin along with fasting blood sugar is because when you use a validated equation such as HOMA-IR, a homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance, you can gauge insulin resistance, which can happen about a decade or 2 before blood sugar becomes abnormal. When there's first insulin resistance, the pancreas compensates by making more insulin that can mask an abnormal blood sugar. So the term prediabetes is a bit of a misconception because it's a process that has been ongoing for quite some time until it manifests. So these earlier ways of detecting that this metabolic disease is happening, I think, are really helpful. I think a lipid panel, basic total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, triglycerides is extremely helpful as well. And blood pressure is such a simple tool. And waist circumference, just so simple, right? You can get a tape measure just simply measuring to see if your waist circumference is greater than 40 inches as a man, as 35 inches as a woman. These are the criteria for metabolic syndrome that we're really talking about. And they're so critical because we know that 93% of people in America do not have good metabolic health. And this is just such a critical piece of our overall health and our aging biology that I think that these are just such basic labs and they give us so much information that that's a good starting point. And these good stressors are incredibly effective at reversing as well as preventing and slowing the progression of metabolic disease.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions and comments from that. So firstly, I think it's great that you pointed out the benefit of ordering fasting insulin, because as you say, the pancreas can just compensate and produce more insulin, and so your blood glucose, blood sugar can look normal for a while, even though your body is just essentially, your pancreas is putting the foot on the accelerator. And it's only a matter of time until it begins to wear out. And with that, you're going to see increases in blood sugar. So I think that's really important to point out, because often people just get the blood glucose measurements and think that they're okay and there's nothing to act on. So that's really useful. My question to you would be, of the good stressors, given how important metabolic health is, which ones do you think are most impactful when it comes to improving metabolic health?
If I had to pick one, I would put exercise as the one. I think exercise can just send such a strong stimulus in a very quick amount of time that creates this metabolic stress, that our bodies adapt in a way that helps overcome insulin resistance very rapidly. So I would put that as first, and then a close second would be the timing of our meals and our circadian biology. So fasting, I think. And I think next I would put, in terms of magnitude, the phytochemical response that we have to stressed plants, and heat and cold therapy would certainly, I would not put as first line. I think they're adjuncts to the exercise and dietary piece.
Okay, so that was the lab biomarkers that people can keep an eye on, and particularly the cardiometabolic ones. You mentioned blood pressure as well, waist circumference. What about the aging biomarkers that you mentioned? I think you said you've done some research here. Do we have, clinical evidence or any evidence that these good stresses and the subsequent activation of these biological pathways really slows aging at a cellular level? And is that something we can keep an eye on?
So I will talk a little bit about the biomarkers and where we can go with them. And I can also mention a study we did that looked at a hormetic association between stress and biological age. The current state of these biological markers of aging is in evolution, and I think they're getting better. Biological age is essentially determining a person's age that can be different from chronologic age based on methylation of our human genome through our lifelong exposures. And through a vial of blood, we can measure about 950,000 foci on the human genome. We can take that data, use machine learning algorithms that have been trained on different models to get an estimate of biological age. The older models, the Horvath and Hannum models, were trained on chronologic age. And second generation clocks like PhenoAge, GrimAge include some phenotypic markers Hence, things like whether a person smokes, etc., they are, have been improved upon. But the limitation with these biological aging markers is really epigenetic changes happen over a course of a lifetime, and they're not very sensitive to short interventions of change. So more sensitive to intervention that you do over a shorter time frame, which would be things like these good stressors, would be utilizing a tool such as the Dunedin pace clock, which is looking at your rate of aging. So I think that may become a better metric than some of the biological aging or epigenetic clocks. And the other part to that is that the ICC, or the interclass correlation coefficient, that's essentially if you're doing the same biological age test, how reliable is it? Are you going to get the same response when you repeat that test over and over? And with the biological age markers, it's not as tight. The ICC is not as tight, so you get a broader range of responses, whereas with the Dunedin pace, you have better reliability with the ICC. And so I think as a marker that holds more potential. What do we know so far? So we, for example, looked at psychological stress and its correlation with biological age. So already there's a shortcoming here in that we're not showing causality. We are essentially just looking for an association. So I can't say that, we have shown that we are necessarily slowing or accelerating aging. There's a limitation in the methodology in being able to say that. But what I can say is that we designed a study where we were looking at perceived stress and resilience through some validated questionnaires. We also looked at some markers such as cortisol, the ratio of DHEA to cortisol and DHEA levels. And we went into the study with a hypothesis that if a person has higher stress, their rate of aging, or I should say their biological age, was going to be accelerated. And if a person had low stress, they would have deceleration in their biological age. And what was really fascinating is amongst people who had low resilience, we saw a hormetic association where people who had a moderate level of stress that was about the same as normative levels in the United States had a lower biological age than people who had low levels of stress. So again, this hormetic relationship. So it's an association study. I think we, are indirectly finding that there's probably some, some relationship, but certainly there's no causality from that.
Biological age was higher in the people who had a low amount of stress or a high amount of stress compared to those who had moderate.
Yes, and predominantly and more fascinating exactly was this moderate range, because that's what was the part that was not anticipated.
And what is deemed as psychological stress, and what would be good stress from a psychological perspective? If I'm thinking about myself here, and I think you mentioned a deadline earlier. So let's say I've got a deadline. I'm meant to have something written by Sunday, and so I'm sort of walking around a little bit stressed and unsure if I'm going to be able to complete this. Maybe have a little bit of anxiety about what that looks like. Is that the same type of stress from a psychological perspective as if I have an acute, let's say I have a little argument or tiff with my partner and I get the increase in heart rate, I get a little flushed, that flooding's happening. There's like this sympathetic nervous system response and I shut down. And I'm sure that cortisol and adrenaline gets released during that. Are these different stimuli?
Yeah, they are different. the argument or a TIF is really a threat-based type of stimulus. And in general, the ones that are good stressors, the commonality is that they align with your belief system. They provide you with meaning. They are usually provide a social good, contribute to something bigger than us. And that, they're motivating, but the result isn't entirely clear. I mean, there's a degree of doubt, so that kind of maximizes your dopamine release. Stressors that fall into those categories, the biochemical response that's released is different than a pure fight or flight type threat-based response. When we have stressors that are so meaningful that they are essentially worth enduring the stress, the biochemical profile releases hormones, like I mentioned, dopamine, which is the reward hormone, serotonin, which some dub the happy hormone, oxytocin, if it's contributing to a greater good, which helps us with bonding and connecting to our partners and the people we care about. These hormones and neurotransmitters actually mitigate the effect of cortisol. They negate some of the damage and harm, and they reduce our cortisol reactivity to future stressors. So it's really how these good stressors are making us more resilient to the argument, to the chronic stressors and the ones that aren't controllable.
Maybe in the context of an argument or a TIF, whether that could be a good or a bad stress or have a net negative or positive effect could be like whether or not or how that is resolved. Because you could resolve a disagreement or a conflict and it could lead to greater bonding.
100%. 100%. If the hardship led to reaching, some level of, strengthening the bond in a relationship, difficult conversations are ones that help us build these pathways in our brain that help us handle future stress. So absolutely, because then there's a far more beneficial side. It's not entirely threat-based, and it changes the biochemical response that your body's going through when you're encountering that stress.
Well, there we go. That's some incentive if you find yourself in fight or flight in an argument and you know that there's a bunch of cortisol flooding through your body. Try and mitigate the effect of some of that with some oxytocin.
Simon, the really cool part is sometimes the simple reframing and this understanding that stress can be beneficial, that mindset alone actually reduces cortisol reactivity, which is to me just so fascinating. Just a simple understanding is enough to create a different response in your body, even with nothing else changed, right? So just changing your mindset from all stress is harmful to stress can be beneficial. So that's a very simple starting point.
We've mentioned a few of the good stresses that you outline in your book, but just to make it super clear, you mentioned 5 core good stresses. What are these 5?
Yeah, so the 5 good stressors are phytochemicals, or plant-based chemicals, exercising with intervals of intensity, heat stress and cold stress, so thermal stress, fasting in a pattern that aligns with our circadian biology, and good mental and emotional stressors.
So let's double click on phytochemicals to begin with here. So you say plants' stress responses build our own stress responses. So what's happening here? How does ingesting phytochemicals, and I may get you to comment on what phytochemicals are for anyone who's unclear there, but how does ingesting these compounds actually make us healthier?
So phytochemicals are plant chemicals, and they give fruits, vegetables, and plants their colors and their flavors. And so essentially a strawberry, the brighter it is in color, the sweeter and juicier it tastes, the higher phytochemical it has. And phytochemicals are non-nutritive, meaning that they don't add calories, so they're not like the macromolecule, the macronutrients that there's so much debate around, like the fat, the carbs, and the proteins. But I think that they have been forgotten in that conversation and all the debates and their role of importance in our human health. So phytochemicals, I think, are just nature's pharmacy. They contain the antioxidants, the anti-inflammatories, the anti-cancer properties of plant-based foods. And the historical viewpoint towards these phytochemicals was that when we consume these phytochemicals, they give us antioxidants, and that helps us counter the free radical damage or the oxidative stress that we incur throughout our lives and through exposures, through pollution, through smoke, through sunlight, through our body's own metabolic processes and our mitochondria. And that really has been the predominant thinking in the last 50 years of nutrition science. But the kind of puzzle within that is that the amount of phytochemical that we absorb, the antioxidants that we absorb when we consume these plant-based foods, are on the order of like nanomolar amounts. I mean, they're such small amounts. And the amount that we would need to neutralize free radical damage is more on the order of like micromolar amounts. So the numbers simply just didn't add up. And the kind of viewpoint is that what is really happening is a hormetic response. When we eat these plant chemicals, what happens is they activate our body's innate defense systems. They ramp up our antioxidant defenses. And that is why a small amount can lead to such beneficial effects. So the natural question then is, why does our body perceive these as stressful? Like, why does it have this effect on our body? And the reason is that when we consume these plants, the plants have made the phytochemicals as part of their stress response. When plants are exposed to drought, to ultraviolet light, to predators, they make phytochemicals to build their disease resistance. They make these phytochemicals as pesticides to deter us as humans and as well as insects from eating them. And so they're essentially toxins. And when we consume these, our bodies evolve ways to rapidly detoxify these plant toxins. We absorb only a small amount and then we rapidly eliminate them. But that small amount is just enough to stress our cells and trigger these adaptive mechanisms. And it really speaks to this deep relationship that we have evolved with plants over the existence of our species, that we've grown to depend on these plants to activate our ability to become more resistant to all these environmental exposures. So it not only ramps up our antioxidant defenses, but it ramps up all these repair mechanisms that we're talking about. It helps us repair our DNA, repair our proteins, increase autophagy, increase our mitochondrial capacity. So the phytochemicals are these integral pieces to us becoming our healthiest selves.
So what are people overlooking online? There are certain people who say, as you just mentioned, that these are part of a plant's defense system and could be considered as toxins, who say there is no reason to be consuming these. At any level, they are toxic to humans. What are these people overlooking?
They're overlooking that these are toxins, but they're not toxic. I mean, that's really the key here. That our bodies need a small amount of stress. And with a lack of exposure to these toxins, we cannot be our healthiest selves. If you look at studies such as the Global Burden of Disease study, which is one of the largest scale studies looking at the association of diet with mortality. So the Global Burden of Disease study looked at dietary intake over 27 years, 195 countries. And what they found was that lack of these plant-based foods, so lack of phytochemicals and fibers and other components of plant-based foods from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, contributed more to global mortality than removing things such as processed meats or red meats or sugar sweetened beverages. And what was really profound is the magnitude of effect. So removing what these foods that are often vilified, like sugar sweetened beverages, the amount of mortality attributed to those was such a smaller amount than the mortality benefit, or I should say the mortality attributed to not getting enough of these plant foods. And for example, if you just take inadequate intake of whole grains, it had a 30-fold higher magnitude of contribution to mortality than removing, again, these vilified foods. So I think it just speaks to how critical and vital it is for us to incorporate plant food. And the message is that you don't have to change your baseline diet to benefit from adding plant food, right? So whether a person's current diet or preference is vegan, whether it's omnivore, carnivore, whatever dietary pattern you choose to follow, the simple addition of plant-based foods can reduce mortality and improve your quality of life and reduce morbidity.
Yeah, that is a really interesting way of looking at things, that some of the exposures that are much maligned, like ultra-processed foods or even sitting down, quite frankly, they may be inherently bad and probably likely are, but they don't fully explain the chronic disease burden that we see, and much of it is likely explained by the opportunity cost. When you're sitting all day, what are you not doing? Well, you're not doing high intensity exercise, and when you're filling up with a lot of calories from ultra processed foods, what are you not eating? What is being displaced from the diet? I like the way that you're looking at that. I'm always on the lookout for ways to refine what's already working and make it better, whether it's in training, nutrition, or recovery. And that is exactly what Hormesis has done with their upgraded 100% plant protein. If you're vegan, plant curious, or just trying to find convenient ways to eat more plant protein for your long-term health, this one is certainly worth a look. It tastes great, the texture is super smooth, and the ingredient list is about as clean as it gets. No gums, no fillers, just grade A, 100% pure Colombian. Oh wait, that's a quote from Blow. But you get the picture. It's made with pea and rice protein, sourced exclusively from the US and Canada. And as always, it's NSF certified for sport. That means that every batch is tested for heavy metals, contaminants, and label accuracy, the same standard that is used by pro sports leagues and the Olympics. Head to livemomentus.com today and use the code LIVINGPROOF for 35% off your first subscription order. When you think about phytochemicals and you think about, specific phytochemicals and known pathways that are activated, and the fact that, to my knowledge, there's tens of thousands of these things, probably many we don't yet fully understand or haven't identified. As a listener, what's the best way of approaching this? Is it the age-old kind of saying of eat the rainbow and just trying to incorporate lots of color and different plant foods into your diet across the week? Or are there specific phytochemicals or specific food or food groups that you think people should really focus on?
I think, if we want to keep it simple, where you don't maybe have to dedicate a lot of energy and resources to optimizing diet at a high level, I think simply adding plant-based food will get you to this goal, because the phytochemicals that are known to work hormetically are found in such an abundance of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, that simply just adding any of these plant foods will get you to your goal. Now, we do know that there are certain phytochemicals that work hormetically. We know from lab-based studies their mechanism of action and the specific cellular stress responses that they activate. So you can do a more targeted approach. So for example, there are 10 phytochemicals that we know work in this manner. Resveratrol, that's in grapes and berries, pistachios, dark chocolate. We know that can activate our antioxidant defenses, sirtuin response, autophagy, DNA damage response, our inflammatory response. We know sulforaphane which is in cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, arugula. It can also be a very potent activator of our antioxidant defenses. And allicin and garlic, onions, shallots also stimulates growth factor through allowing calcium into these pores that activate growth. The list also includes quercetin, capsaicin, curcumin, ferulic acid, EGCG, genistein, luteolin. So you can create a targeted approach, and you can also approach it as what cellular stress response you would like to optimize. So for example, if you said, look, I want to optimize mitochondrial biogenesis, activate the sirtuin response in particular, you can focus on, for example, resveratrol, quercetin, EGCG, genistein. We know that those in particular are potent stimulators of the sirtuin response. So you can certainly do this in a great degree of detail. I have some of this in the book and to break it down, but I think one of the biggest goals is, number one, just get more plant food. Number two, plant-based diversity. And this is so key because the more diverse your intake of plant food, the more you are taking in the abundance of the phytochemicals that are around. So, I think as a rough rule of thumb, largely driven by what we understand from fiber, the recommendation is 30 or more plant food. But I think that would be a very nice extrapolation to getting the phytochemical diversity that you need. What's really profound when you look at this in a historical context is that the Homo sapiens diet of our hunter-gatherer ancestors contained over 3,000 plant species. I mean, really profound. But by necessity, our ancestors had to subsist on diversity of edible foods to get the caloric intake to survive. Current state is that out of the 30,000 edible foods in this world, we cultivate around 150, and only about 30 of those are making it to our plates each year. So this reduction of diversity, which has been part of, again, the cost of comfort, like you mentioned, the cost of the convenience, the cost that has come from adding food processing technology to avoid starvation, the cost of adding food preservation where the food is around the clock. These have all contributed to such a shift in our dietary intake that has removed us from these stressors that our bodies have grown to depend on to thrive.
That makes you want to go down to the local farmer's market and get the different varieties of apples and peaches and plums and potatoes and just mix things up a little bit more.
100%. I mean, there are like 10,000 varieties of just tomatoes alone, right? I mean, we don't even scratch the surface of the abundance and the variety that's available to us.
Yeah, I'm also pretty conscious of trying to use and cook with as much herbs and spices as I can, because I know they're like particularly phytochemical rich, I guess, on a per gram basis.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned ECGC, so that's found in green tea, I believe.
Yes.
Among other foods, but particularly rich in green tea, and genistein in soy foods, right?
Correct.
Let's move on to intermittent fasting. So you describe a 14-hour overnight fast as the Goldilocks zone. Why is that window ideal, and what happens overnight to our cells while we're in that fasted kind of period?
There are so many ways to intermittent fast, and the type that I advocate from the lens of Hormesis is time-restricted eating. So all of your eating in a certain number of hours. And I think from there, what that time interval of eating should be depends on multiple variables. Those would include what your health goals are. For example, if your goal is longevity versus improving metabolic health, reversing disease versus prevention. So those goals can affect the time frame. And your current health is a variable, your gender is a variable, your age is a variable. So the reason, so I'll start by saying that I think kind of a normal eating pattern really should be trying to eat all of your calories in a 12-hour window. And that's largely because your body needs to go kind of more than 12 hours to enter some of these housekeeping functions that trigger repair and the recycling that is so critical for our health. And if we're in a less than 12-hour window, we aren't doing a lot of these repair processes. So our bodies and our cells can either be in one phase or another. Our cells can either be growing and proliferating, or they can be repairing. And they can either be building up energy storage, they can be breaking down energy storage. So it's either one or the other. And an imbalance between the two is what leads to disease. So if we have too much energy storage relative to breakdown, that takes us down a path of metabolic disease. If we have too much growth in our cells, which sounds really good, but essentially too much growth can lead to diseases like cancer, etc. You have to balance that out with repair mechanisms at the cellular level. So 12 hours kind of helps us stay in the balance that our bodies are meant to be in. Beyond that, getting to this extended window of 14 hours of fasting or 10 hours of eating window, that optimizes for metabolic health, which again is such a key component of our overall health, because one of the first things that happens when we do intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating is improvements in metabolic health, primarily improvements in insulin sensitivity or reduction in insulin resistance. Part of that is because when we are in a fasted state, we are utilizing our glycogen stores and we're breaking down fat for energy, which our body converts to ketones. Our cells want to become very energy efficient. They want to uptake whatever glucose is available. And when we recover from the fasting period, they want to store the glycogen more effectively, kind of overcome insulin resistance, so that when we fast again, the next day of repetition, that we are, have that ability to take in more glucose into our cells. So this ability to overcome insulin resistance is one of the key things that happens within that time frame. You can certainly do longer time periods. For example, if your goal is deeper states of autophagy, longer time periods would make sense, because if you, again, think of a cell as, trying to use the energy that's available when you're in the fasted state, at the first level, you're going to uptake the glucose that's around, become more insulin sensitive, become more metabolically efficient. Then the body has to use what it already has. So if there are cells that are older, that are damaged, it'll try and repair those cells to become more efficient, or it will recycle those cells and use some of those components for energy. So that is, essentially autophagy, a self-eating process. So that's a deeper state of energy deprivation that activates that. So again, you could do these longer states, but I think the sweet spot, when you balance kind of health in a more holistic way, when you take into consideration, what's practical, what's feasible, So time restricted eating in really even as small as an 8-hour window, let alone trying to do it in a 10-hour window in a year-long study. I don't think we have much longer than that, but in the Annals of Internal Medicine, there's certainly a year-long study that showed about 87% success rate. So it seems very feasible. It certainly has been shown to be safe. And I think that is kind of a sweet spot for metabolic health. Shorter time windows add very small incremental benefit to that 10-hour time frame. And the 10 hours also allows you to get adequate protein intake. Certainly when I've tried to shorten my window, I think it's very challenging to get your daily protein intake. So when you think of health in a holistic way, balancing what your energy needs are, giving yourself enough time to get that, that's kind of where I've kind of landed with this 14-hour or 10-hour eating, 14-hour fasting window.
How do you feel about some of the more extreme fasting examples that people might come across online? And I think I know how people arrive there. If I think about my own sort of eating window, I've eaten in a 10-hour eating window for 3-4 years. And I will say that it's now just a habit and it's not uncomfortable for me. So now I'm actually second guessing, is that dose right? Is this something I have to push, and do I have to narrow that window even more to get the benefits of fasting? Or am I risking, like you said just then, that I'm eating in such a narrow window that I'm not getting enough total calories or protein or micronutrients to support my activity levels? And so I think what we see out there, online, you see these examples of people who maybe started with a 10-hour eating window, but then 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the track, all of a sudden they're doing 3-5 days with no food, doing that regularly. Like, how does someone know what the appropriate dose is for them?
Again, I think you have to start with a question of what are your goals, right? So if it's deeper levels of autophagy, which, potentially, even though we don't know the effect on longevity, and there's maybe some preliminary data on some regenerative ability in pancreatic islet cells from these deeper, longer fasts. I mean, there's a potential place for them. I'm coming at it from the perspective of hormesis and what is optimal when we look at a lifestyle that we should be living for longevity and disease prevention. And that window, that 14-hour fasting window, 10-hour eating window, is really the optimal for triggering that mild to moderate stress. So again, as we talked about earlier, when you stress yourself in a kind of beyond a mild to moderate amount, there's a limit to how much resilience you can build from that exposure. So kind of pushing beyond or even, stacking different stressors, you don't always gain more benefit. Like, our body just doesn't work that way. When you look at it from activating all of our disease-resistant mechanisms that can be activated by these stressors. So for me, I think that is why this is such a sweet spot. You want that mild to moderate, and it's that daily pattern that I think is helping you of stress recovery. Again, this recovery piece is key. When you do an extended multi-day fast, the recovery is when your body does the growing of the preferentially healthier cells. So the fasting without the recovery on a regular basis is I think a missing piece in all of this. If we're looking at this as a habit for a lifetime. And then with the more extended fast, the challenge, I've done some of those, and the challenge I've run into is I just simply cannot work out at a level that I would like to. And when my dietary intake is limiting my ability to do exercise, which I think is so important, I'm thinking of this as a lifestyle practice, then to me, whatever I'm gaining, there's clearly something I'm losing.
With the 14-hour a day fasting, so eating in the 10-hour eating window. Do you have any thoughts on stacking that with exercise, particularly cardio? I know a lot of people are interested in this idea of fasted cardio. If you get up in the morning and you're in that period of 14 hours of fasting and you go and do your cardio, are there additional benefits up for grabs? Are you stressing some of these biological aging pathways a little more?
Yeah, this is such a great question, and so many nuances to finding that optimal stacking. So part of it is going to be, what is that workout, right? If you are doing a zone 2 workout, then you potentially could get an added effect. If you are doing a high intensity interval workout, that higher stress plus being in a fasted state could potentially be too much of a stressor to your body. That can, again, the reason I say this is because when you're in a fasted state, your body is already looking at your fats as your primary source of energy. And you're using ketones in that fasted state. If you're doing a zone 2 where you're primarily using the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, relying on mitochondrial fat burning, in that zone, some stacking could be beneficial. If you're trying to do a high intensity interval workout where you're trying to use part of the anaerobic glycolytic pathway along with the oxidative phosphorylation, the mitochondrial pathway of energy, then you simply don't have the ability to, you just don't have the glycogen stores at that point. So you'll probably bonk, and that may be just too much of a stressor. And so again, it depends on the type of workout. And another layer to add to that are potential gender differences. So women are more energy or nutrient sensitive. And part of that is just evolutionarily based. So if, women were to conceive a child and our ancestors were faced in an environment of, inadequate food or starvation, it would not be optimal for a woman to conceive. So women have just become more nutrient sensitive. That's one proposed reason for it, why the lack of incoming nutrients can be sensed as a greater stress. So there could be some gender differences in the ability to exercise in that fasted state.
So women may need more fuel going into that cardio workout, even if it's a zone 2 workout.
Yes. And this is, again, there's going to be so much individual variability that it's very hard to make a kind of overarching generalizations, but there's certainly a potential for that to happen. The challenge here that we're facing is that we're talking about healthy men and healthy women. And the reality is that most of our country is metabolically unhealthy, relying more on the kind of glycolytic pathways, because when mitochondria are impaired, our ability for fat utilization is decreased. So we rely more on our glycolytic pathway that uses glucose for energy creation. And as a result of that, I think it becomes very challenging to exercise in a fasted state for people with metabolic disease as well, but it is also hugely beneficial. So I think it's just finding what feels right as an individual. And if we go back to this overarching principle that with good stress, you feel good afterwards, you feel energized. With kind of harmful stress, or when you've pushed too much, you feel fatigued and unwell. That's kind of the overarching framework for trying to see if whatever intervention you're doing is helping you or not.
I've had a bunch of friends ask me recently, Simon, do you actually rate 8 sleep? So here's the truth. I would not promote 8 sleep if it hadn't genuinely helped me. It has literally transformed my sleep. Since adding the Pod 4 Ultra and then more recently the Pod 5 Ultra to my bed, I've been waking up feeling fresh, clear-headed, less inflamed in the face and fingers, and ready to take on the day with enthusiasm, rigor, kindness, and patience, all good things. That's what a proper night of recovery does. It literally makes me a better human. The Pod 5 isn't a mattress. It's a high-tech cover that fits over your existing bed. It personalizes the temperature on each side, tracks your sleep stages, and even detects snoring, gently adjusting your position to help stop it. And now with the new Pod Blanket, that same intelligent temperature control extends across your entire body. It's like sleeping in a cocoon that actively helps you recover. This is hands down one of the best investments I've ever made for my health. Head to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF to get $350 off your Pod 5 Ultra. And you've got 30 days to try it. And if you don't like it, which I can't see happening, send it back for a full refund. Shipping to many countries worldwide. See details at 8sleep.com/theproof. Is there a type of exercise that you would say is superior to other forms when it comes to stressing these systems and acting as a good stress stimulus?
I think a type that you absolutely non-negotiably have to include is some level of vigorous or high intensity exercise. Again, we need certain deliberate stressors to optimize our biology. And part of the reason we need high intensity is that the stimulus to our body is such a stronger stimulus that it triggers different adaptations. When you exercise with high intensity, you're creating more metabolic stress and more oxidative stress. And that is the signal for our body to activate our antioxidant responses. And it's such a potent stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis, and that I think that you certainly can't optimize your metabolic health without it. Part of the reasons for that mechanistically are when you exercise in these higher intensity zones, the more vigorous zones, in, say, a high interval, like a high intensity interval workout, you are going to create lactate in an amount that's in excess of what the mitochondria can clear. So when you pass the zone 2, lactate is a signaling molecule, and signaling molecules are essentially sending messages to other parts of your body. And lactate is a potent activator of PGC1 alpha, which is a transcriptional coactivator. So it's essentially the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis. So that is one mechanistic pathway of why it's such a potent trigger of creating new mitochondria. And also the lactate can also increase the GLUT4 transporters up to 48 hours. So another way where it makes your body very metabolically efficient by uptaking glucose out of your circulation. What's interesting is when you look at clinical studies comparing the same workload of people doing moderate intensity continuous exercise versus high intensity, there are greater gains in VO2 max and cardiopulmonary fitness with the same workload. So that already gives you a hint that you are getting better mitochondrial health from, or you certainly are pushing to a higher level of mitochondrial health with this higher VO2 max. The other component that's really fascinating is some level of mitophagy that is probably also happening in these higher states. So mitophagy is a selective form of autophagy. So there's macroautophagy, chaperone-mediated autophagy, and selective forms such as targeted towards mitochondria. And when you have such a strong stress stimulus from the rapid depletion of energy and the oxidative stress, you're triggering more of the autophagy, the selective autophagy. And what you're doing is you're not only creating new mitochondria through mitochondrial biogenesis, but you're also clearing out the damaged mitochondria. And so one way to think about this is if you think of mitochondria as creating this energy grid in your body, mitochondrial biogenesis is essentially creating renewable energy, but mitophagy helps you kind of create cleaner emissions in your body with less free radicals. So you're kind of creating more clean energy through the processes of biogenesis and mitophagy. So it's essentially mitohormesis. And I think, again, this is hugely important because the organelle of stress is essentially our mitochondria, right? So we think of the brain as the organ for our stress response that orchestrates the nervous system response to stress, but the mitochondria are the key organelle of these good stressors. And so much of our health relies on our health of our mitochondria, the flow of energy in our body, our overall metabolism, and that really is the convergence point for our resilience, both mentally and physically, because our mitochondria are also key in our synthesis of cortisol. They also impact our ability to make other neurotransmitters such as serotonin and norepinephrine. So I think that they are the integrator. They are the point of convergence of how our mind and body are connected, and how improving our metabolic and mitochondrial health improve really at a system level our overall health.
And just to be clear, this is exercising at an intensity where it's like an 8 or a 9 out of 10 effort, or your heart rate is at like 80-85% max heart rate, somewhere around there?
Yeah, so it doesn't even have to be. What I love about these good stressors, Simon, is that they're practical, everyday, accessible to everybody. Certainly, there are protocols. You can do a Norwegian 4x4 protocol where during the intervals of intensity, you are roughly in a lot of these high intensity intervals, you're about 80 to 95% of your maximum heart rate. So not sprint interval training. You're not at an all-out level where you're 95% or above, but at a high intensity. And part of the reason for that is you want to be able to sustain that interval for 2 to 5 minutes. When you do these intervals, the higher you're longer you're able to sustain that, the more you are kind of training yourself to build a higher VO2 max. So that's what you want with a high intensity. But what I think is really amazing is studies showing that even if you reach a vigorous zone, that if we use the rate of perceived exertion as our scale of where we are, so moderate intensity is around like a 5 to 6 out of 10 in terms of how we would rate how hard that exercise is. Vigorous would be 7 or above. Once you're just in vigorous range, you're already creating a stronger stimulus for improving your VO2 max. So there's this beautiful study done in Japanese middle-aged and older people where they had people walk in intervals as opposed to continuous paced walking. So one group walked in 3 minutes, just fast, picked up the pace of walking. 3 minutes, slowed down, caught their breath, 3 minutes faster walking, 3 minutes backed off, versus another group that walked at a continuous pace, 30 minutes, 4 times a week or greater. And over a 5-month period, the group that walked in intervals had a 15% improvement in their VO2 max and reduced their metabolic risk factors by about 20%, which is really phenomenal. I mean, you can take any activity you enjoy doing, whether you like cycling, whether you like hiking, dancing, anything, and just do it in intervals as opposed to continuous pace. And that alone is going to move the needle on your cardiorespiratory fitness.
Yeah, and the other thing worth pointing out there is that this is not something you can compare to someone else. So your 7 or 8 out of 10 is dependent on your level of fitness and health. So that could be, like you just mentioned there, it could be a brisk walk, or for someone else, it could be on the treadmill, putting it up at 15 kilometers an hour and going all out almost.
That is such a key point, because when we're talking about doing something hard or stressing yourself, it is what is hard for you. And that's going to be different from person to person, and it's going to be different for you over time as you build your tolerance. So all of these stressors are deliberate. We're choosing to add them, but we can do them, and any one of us can do this. High intensity seems intimidating, but there's another study done. This was a British study. Average age 71 years old, introduced a high intensity interval workout, unsupervised at home with a 15-minute workout, 1-minute intervals of high intensity with 5 1-minute intervals separated, with rest intervals in between. And the amazing part is that they found that even people at age 71 were able to do this at home unsupervised. So it's what is intense to you, and that is so critical, that we're not saying go hard. We're not saying that, you have to, essentially kill yourself, because Hormesis, a lot of people say, oh, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But that is such a misconception. It shouldn't kill you. We're talking about ordinary everyday stress, not like seismic stressors.
Is that kind of towards the minimum effective volume? Like in that study, I think you said it was about 5 minutes of high intensity exercise, whatever that looks like for the individual based on their physical fitness level. Is that what we're looking at here, where like this is great for someone who's on a time crunch? Across a week, we're talking about having, at least 5 minutes of high intensity exercise in the week. Is that when most of the benefit is kind of earned and it begins to taper off after that?
Yeah, I love this idea of minimum effective dose, because I think of good stressors as medicine, right? So like, what's the lowest dose, and how do you adjust the dose for the optimum amount to not get a side effect, right? So this is a really perfect way to look at it. And I would say the minimum effective dose is actually even less than that. So when you look at, for example, vigorous lifestyle-based physical activity that's intense. So vigorous, like Vilpas, these bursts of intense physical activity throughout the day. What's really fascinating is that, this is another study done in 25,000 people, mean age of 62, out of the UK Biobank. And over an average follow-up of 6.9 years, people who did 3 bouts a day of 1 to 2 minutes each of these vigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity bursts had about a 40% reduction in cancer and all-cause mortality, and about a 50% reduction in cardiovascular disease mortality. So I would say the minimum effective dose can be as simple as just 3 bouts a day, 1 to 2 minutes.
That's good news. That sounds accessible to a lot of people.
Exactly. And a lot of this is, again, I'm really advocating for a lifestyle of good stress. This is a regenerative lifestyle that's accessible and practical, as the theme of how we're meant to live.
Right. Or else you can find yourself stressed out about chasing stress, which is chronic stress we're not trying to create here.
Right. This is deliberate, right? This is a choice. And that's so key, right? Like, all of these stressors are a choice. They're deliberate. And by definition, then they're controllable. We can have this sense of mastery, and they shouldn't be stressing us out.
Saunas and ice baths, all the rage right now.
Yes.
I love that you're coming at this from a scientific perspective. What do we need to understand here about exposing ourselves to hot and cold? What's happening at a cellular level, and how do you want people to think about this and consider it in their own life?
Yeah. So I, again, view this from the perspective of hormesis. And heat and cold are thermal stressors. They throw our bodies out of balance. So our body has a natural temperature that's roughly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. When we are exposed to cold, our core body temperature drops. When we're exposed to heat, our core body temperature goes up, and that kicks in all these feedback mechanisms that our body uses to reestablish that homeostatic temperature where our enzymes function optimally. in that process of our body kicking in these responses, we activate these cellular stress responses that start the repair processes, the clearance of damage from our bodies. They reduce inflammation, reduce oxidative damage. So these protocols for heat and cold are helping us at a cellular level achieve a lot of these repair and regenerative functions. So I think that they're promising from that standpoint. There are also physiologic benefits to each of them. For example, with cold exposure, our body responds to cold by turning on this internal space heater we have called brown fat. And brown fat is very metabolically active, and what's really kind of fascinating is whereas white fat stores energy, brown fat is trying to break it down. It's utilizing fats and glucose to generate heat. So there's a lot of interest in, can we use brown fat to improve our metabolic health, kind of breaking down our stores just as fasting or exercise would do. I think that's hugely interesting. Most of the increase in our metabolism that happens through cold exposure happens from muscle shivering. We simply just have so much more muscle mass than we do brown fat that a lot of the improvements to our metabolism are coming from the muscle shivering as opposed to non-shivering thermogenesis. But nonetheless, I think this is a really exciting area. And I think we're going to see a lot more studies right now. There's a lot of association studies that people who have more brown fat tend to have lower BMIs. There are association studies as well with different lipid parameters. But I think we're going to potentially see more as brown fat as something that can be used in different capacities to help our metabolic health. Heat, I think we have stronger data on than we do with cold. Part of that is because with heat, the protocols are much more consistent. They're generally sauna protocols with longitudinal data. With cold, they're usually smaller studies, many different protocols. It's very hard to make strong generalizations. With heat, it mimics exercise. When our bodies are trying to dissipate heat, sweating is our internal air conditioner, and our body's trying to shunt blood to our skin where we can evaporate the heat. In that process, our heart rate goes up, and we can mimic really moderate to high intensity exercise. So our heart rate can be anywhere from 120 to 150 beats per minute from sauna exposure. And that process creates a shearing force on our blood vessels, and that shear stress from the blood being shunted towards the periphery improves our endothelial function. The endothelium is that lining between the blood and our blood vessel wall, and we have like 60,000 miles of endothelium. And as those endothelial cells experience the shear force, they release more nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It reduces clotting ability in our blood vessels. It reduces oxidative stress. It reduces inflammation. So it essentially is making our endothelial lining healthier, which reduces our risk of cardiovascular disease. So there's, I think, a lot of benefit to using thermal stress. I would say it's an adjunct, again, to diet and exercise, not a substitute, but I think a very overlooked way that we can improve our health.
So perhaps first getting the phytochemicals into the diet, thinking about a 10-hour eating window, getting the high-intensity exercise, and then from there, when those are in play and consistent with those, thinking about this thermal exposure. I can see people now, Sharon, thinking, okay, I'm going to fast, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to do my cardio, I'm going to go straight from my cardio into a sauna, and maybe before I hop in the sauna, I'll grab a broccoli sprout juice and stack all of these things together.
You know, again, I think there's merit to each of these, but you kind of have to experiment a little bit. Certainly, if you do a nice cardio workout, then go into the sauna, you can extend some of the benefits from the cardio workout. And, certainly for people who can't exercise, sauna has a lot of benefit. I think with the way to kind of look at how do you incorporate these good stressors is start with one, kind of get to where you feel that your health is optimized, like kind of track how you feel. With each one, you want to push past your comfort zone, but not to the point of overwhelm. Take time for recovery. Then introduce the next and kind of in that fashion stack the habits. And I think that collectively you can create a very healthy lifestyle by doing it that way.
Is sauna something that you use personally? And if so, what does that look like in terms of number of times a week, or how long do you stay in there?
Yeah. So my access to sauna is my limitation. So I wish I had one in my home, but I don't. So my limitation is I have to go to a gym to access sauna. What is more practical for my day to day is hot baths. And I would say that for anyone listening who doesn't have fancy equipment, this is also a way to practically incorporate these good stresses in your life. So a hot bath between 102 to 104 degrees has a lot of the benefits we're talking about. It can activate heat shock proteins, which is one of the mechanisms by which we get a lot of the benefits from heat. And I do that a couple times a week as time allows, close to bedtime, so that I can naturally allow my body to cool off, and that cooling off process helps with getting better sleep at night.
And just to be clear, that's 102 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit, absolutely, yes.
For my Australian listeners out there.
Yes.
We don't want you to get into 102 to 104 degrees Celsius.
No.
Another line that I underlined from your book was psychological stresses can enhance physical fitness and vice versa. Can you explain this idea of cross adaptation, where doing mentally hard things can help us become physically stronger and vice versa?
Yeah. What we're doing with the good stressors is we're improving the health of our cells. And that is, one way to look at that is if you view your cells as coming off of an assembly line. If your cells are damaged, let's say your mitochondria are impaired, or you have damage to your DNA, or your proteins are damaged, that damage is going to go to wherever that cell is used. So for example, it can be a cell that's a neuron, and that can compromise brain function. It can be a cell that goes to the heart. It compromises heart function. It can be a muscle cell. It compromises your muscle function. So essentially, when you are incorporating any of the good stressors, whether they're mental or physical, you're improving the health of your cells. And your cellular health is a micro version of your overall health. Cross-adaptation really happens because whether you're using a physical stressor to improve the health of your cells, or you're using a psychological stressor to improve the health of your cells, each kind of reinforces the other. And that is really part of the beauty of a good stress approach, that you are creating this holistic approach to health that's connecting the mind and the body. It's like a systems biology approach that's making every part of you healthier. And it's also helping multiple chronic diseases, because the root of the chronic diseases that we see, as well as aging, is impairment of cellular function. At its core, it's either mitochondria not working effectively, it's lack of autophagy, it is proteins being misshapen and damaged and not getting cleared out. So I think this focus on cellular health is such a foundational way to build health, and it works through this cross-adaptation.
And just to kind of be clear, what are the good forms of psychological stress? Or what are your favorite forms of psychological stress?
Yeah, I strongly believe that we should work towards aligning our actions with our beliefs. I think one of the hidden sources of chronic stress in our lives is when there's dysynchrony between what our core beliefs are and how we spend our day. I think a lot of people view external stressors, like financial hardship, difficult relationships, job situations, as their biggest stressors. But this lack of alignment creates such a chronic ongoing stress. Essentially, your body perceives it as lying to yourself, and it creates this smoldering inflammation that can impact have such a far-reaching effect. So I think that trying to create this alignment is so key. And so I work very hard at really asking myself very hard questions of how am I spending my time, and does it bring me a sense that what I'm doing is meaningful? Does it contribute to what I think is my purpose? And how do I adjust my daily actions more towards that alignment? Because I think it has such a profound effect, not just on each of us as individuals, but it affects kind of this influence that we have on people around us in ways that aren't even always spoken or said. I think our end goal of trying to become these resilient selves is so that the influence we have on the people around us is one that uplifts them. And I think this hard work of finding that internal alignment is a key part of emitting a very resilient state and uplifting others, so we become kind of a magnet of calm rather than chaos, where we attract rather than repel. I think this is such a key part, and arguably even more important than some of the physical stressors.
You mentioned hard work, and it is work because you're looking inside. That takes a lot of pausing, a lot of self-awareness, introspection, and the easier avenue, the path of least resistance, is to just not go there sometimes. So what does that look like for you? How do you cultivate that level of self-awareness and introspection so you can kind of conduct that order and make sure you're living congruently with your values and beliefs, as you say?
I think you need to listen to your gut. I think intuitively we know when we are doing things that we simply aren't drawn to do. I think we know it in some gut level, have some gut instinct, but I think we often just drown it out because we know we have to do certain things, or we think something is more socially accepted, and we kind of override that gut instinct. So I think just training yourself to listen to your gut is one starting point. You can also start in a reverse way. You can start with what drives you crazy. For example, I may go crazy when I hear people make absolute generalizations about health and well-being. Well, that then means that one thing that really matters to me is that I value integrity of the science. I value nuance, right? So sometimes you can arrive at what really matters to you by starting at what really pushes your buttons and drives you crazy.
I see that in you. I see that integrity. I can tell you that just in this conversation, there were countless times where I was thinking in my head, spoken like a true scientist. So I'm glad that you were able to come on and be an example of what really high quality science communication looks like. Just as we kind of land the plane here, if you were to leave listeners with one thing, remember one thing from this conversation and give them, a single reason to go and pick up your book, which I hope they all do, what would that one thing be?
I think that one thing is that trusting that we were made to do hard things, that our DNA is hardwired for us to be able to push beyond our comfort level, and that we all have the potential to be better, to do more, to increase our capability of human possibility, which is just limitless. And the gateway to getting there is a willingness to endure good stress. And you're not just doing it for yourself, you're really doing it for everyone around you. The impact of everything that we choose to do, our own well-being, our own health, our own longevity, we know through social contagion studies that we can influence up to 3 degrees of separation. So think of not just how you envision your own health and your own longevity, but think of the role you want to play on the people that you're influencing. And it's not just even in our generation, there are epigenetic changes where we're literally influencing the health of our children through our choices today. So I think that, we can all benefit from these, but we also all kind of give back in so many ways that I think this is such an important investment.
Beautifully put. A beautiful landing, zero turbulence. Hit the tarmac like it was a pillar. Thank you so much for joining us, for taking time out of your day to be with us and educate us on all things good stress. Appreciate you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.